This is a podcast from RadioMoLI, a digital radio station for Irish literature, broadcasting from MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, located on Dublin's St Stephen's Green. For more from RadioMoLI and the Museum of Literature Ireland, visit radio.moli.ie. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that buying MoLI membership for yourself, your family or a friend is the best way to support the museum and its programming. Head over to moli.ie/membership to sign up. Thank you for listening.
UCD has a particular focus on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we've come together with MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, in this project called Past, Present and Pride. It's a way for us to work with, to interview, to hear the voices of LGBTI writers, Irish writers and perhaps some international writers, a way to give voice to the LGBTI experience, to advance issues of diversity, inclusion and equality. I'm Paul Dalton. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in UCD and I also work in St Vincent's Hospital in Allen Park. Our first guest, I'm delighted to say, is Emma Donoghue, a writer, 11 novels, 5 collections of short stories, numerous plays, very well known for the book Room and the film adaptation. Emma is a graduate of UCD and her first novel, Stir Fry, was set in UCD in the 1980s, is a lesbian coming-of-age novel. Emma Donoghue, a very warm virtual welcome to MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, and to Newman House, the foundation house, the foundation of UCD, your alma mater. We are definitely complying with social distancing. You're in Canada.
Thousands of kilometres apart we are. Yes, I'm in London, Ontario, where I live. I'm feeling at home already, Paul, because you pronounced my surname right. It's not something I'm fussy about, given that I live in Canada. But hearing Donaghue, I just think, okay, I'm with those who understand me.
So you're over there and I'm here. So I mean, just jumping right in, your first book and your most recent book, soon to be with us, are both set in Dublin. So I was thinking, to date, your writing is almost bookended by Dublin. Your first book and your most recent. And your first book, firstly, you've published, I think, 11 novels and 5 collections of short stories. Your first book, in 1994, Stir Fry, set in UCD, it opens with the words, 2 women seek flatmate, no bigots. And the central character, Mariah, her life, her coming of age unfolds. It's described as many things, but as a lesbian novel. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, you can draw a line of lesbian literary tradition either through the writers of it, as in whatever we lesbians write is lesbian fiction, or through themes. So of course that's 2 different ways of drawing the line. Stir Fry works under both headings, I would say. And if ever I'm tempted to complain about being pigeonholed at any point in my career, I remember that in fact it got me a lot of extra publicity and a lot of extra attention when I published Stir Fry in 1994. So there are pros and cons to having a label attached to you as a writer, but I certainly can't complain about the lesbian one, because I think whatever helps a writer stand out from the crowd at all, especially when they're first publishing, is a good thing. And also, I've never found it to be a label that sits heavily on my shoulders, because I think my readers have been very willing to allow my imagination to wander off wherever it may find itself.
And Emma, was that the case even in 1994?
It was, oddly enough.
Right.
I found, for instance, my lesbian fan base, they were so grateful. Stir Fry and then my second novel, Hood, both set in Dublin, both lesbian novels, and they were thrilled by that. But nobody ever said to me, "Oh, why have my first sort of big selling novel in 2000, Slammerka, didn't have a lesbian theme, and I've never found my queer fan base to be in any way resentful of that. Sometimes they might poignantly say, "When's your next lesbian themed fiction?" But they don't keep their writers on a tight leash, put it that way.
Right.
I think what lesbian and gay readers appreciate is the freedom of the imagination. So I've always found them appreciative, but in no way strict.
No way confining. Your latest novel, due to be published in a few days, I think.
It comes out in about around the 20th of July.
Right.
The Pull of the Stars. It's set in a Dublin hospital.
Tell us about it.
Well, I wanted to write about the flu pandemic of 1918. I got this, I started writing this book in 2018, thinking of the flu pandemic as purely historical, having no idea that it would come out in the middle of a new pandemic. And I could have said it anywhere in the world, Paul. You know yourself, that pandemic was devastating, perhaps even worse in Asia than in Europe. But there's a lot to be said for knowing your territory, and especially in terms of idiom. So I thought I'll set it in Ireland, I'll set it in a hospital, because I'm very interested in what the weird and crazy atmosphere there must have been in big institutions that were trying to keep people alive and had all these different factors to juggle. And so I thought I'll set it in Dublin. Of course, Dublin in 1918 was a fascinating time and place anyway, because the country was going through such political upheavals in just a couple of years. So I thought it would be a wonderful kind of nexus of political and health crises, was to set it right there. Yeah. But I went for a fictional hospital because I didn't want any one hospital to get up in arms about, was I misrepresenting their practices? Some of these things are very controversial, medical practices of the day, and whether they were, acceptable for the time, or were they always barbaric. So I decided a fictional Dublin hospital would give me that right balance between sort of authenticity and freedom to make it up.
And Emma, it's a maternity hospital, I'm right. So this is about...
It's a maternity ward in
ward.
A general hospital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the first facts that grabbed me about the 1918 pandemic was that a group who got the flu in extraordinary numbers and who suffered a lot from it were pregnant women in late pregnancy, and for a few weeks after birth even. So birth and the great flu, the Spanish flu as some called it, was a terrible kind of, not comorbidities, you might say. So I thought it would be really interesting to set a novel among women who had the flu and were about to give birth, because those two health crises have very different storylines and very different possible outcomes. So I thought it would make it more interesting than just pure flu. And it also allowed me to focus the novel so much on women. It creates this tiny little sort of bubble in which women are intensely suffering and working together and looked after by women nurses and even a woman doctor. So it gave me a weird opportunity to make a kind of little all-woman bubble right in the middle of the more familiar sort of men's territory of war, of World War I and of the Irish revolutionary struggle.
Kathleen Lynn, isn't that right? We're introduced
I was going to use a fictional doctor, but then when I was, researching doctors in 1918 in Dublin, there was Kathleen Lynn, and she's such a fascinating figure because she had fingers in so many pies. She was so committed to the women's struggle, the labour struggle, and then as a result of those, the Irish revolutionary struggle. And she was busy running around Dublin, running a free flu clinic. Her diaries are very vivid on the sheer hectic urgency of trying to figure out how to keep people alive during the flu. And she was living in a relationship with a woman. I mean, she was a fascinating figure. I just thought she was too good to leave out of the book. So she's my one real character. And the novel is narrated by a fictional nurse called Julia Power. And there's also a third key character who's a volunteer helper, because I wanted to show that whole span, that whole range of people in healthcare, from the lowly cleaners who, as we know, are at just as much risk in crisis or pandemic situations, and then the high status doctors as well. Emma,
what we've become very familiar with, the frontline workers in this pandemic. I mean, it must be strange, unusual for you to have done all of this research, to have this book out into the world about a pandemic in a pandemic. I mean, extraordinary.
It's weird. I've never had a novel become suddenly timely in this way. It feels very strange, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, when you write historical fiction, you're always hoping it'll be relevant to today. You know, of course, you know, when I was writing the novel, the things I had to say about, for instance, the way there's a moment in the book when the nurse Julia says to Dr. Lynn, like, I don't have time for politics, I try and stay out of politics. And Dr. Lynn says, everything's political. So, you know, if you care about your patients and if you start to see that the poor ones are dying in greater numbers, or if you start to see that the women who have 12 children are more likely to drop dead, you know, you can't help but start to analyse these things in terms of society's choices, where we spend the money, and social justice. So, yeah, I expected it to have relevant themes for today, but I didn't expect it to be, you know, disturbingly like the issues of today. You know, do you wear masks? How often do you wash your hands? You know, what are the known knowns of contagion, and what are the still unknown knowns? And that atmosphere of dread and panic and busyness, you know, having to keep on working even in situations where you're, you know, in the back of your mind, fear is going tick, tick, tick. Where people are putting their lives at risk to care for other people, that we've seen across the globe and still. And I think what really strikes me is the light that a pandemic in 1918 and now throws on inequality. Oh, it's like a sort of an X-ray for a society, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, you know, I've seen a map of, say, Toronto, near where I live, and the areas with immigrants, the areas with people of colour, the areas with poorer people, that's where it's hitting. So, you know, to describe an illness merely spreading through a city like some wave, that's very naive. It turns out that it attaches itself to poverty in all sorts of ways. And I think, again, the recent Black Lives Matter protests, they're making people more aware than ever. But it's not just accident if people die. You know, in a way, we make decisions early on in life about who's going to live or die.
We do.
So health has never been more political than right now, I think.
And Emma said very recently, you know, that we may be in the same storm, but we're sure not in the same boat. You know?
That's well put, Paul.
Really,
that's
really
so true. And of course, you know, I've had a very easy pandemic. I'm a writer. My job carries on very normally during shutdown. I'm used to staying home, so it hasn't even been a shock to me. And yet I've been so aware there's been this weird gap between the comfort of my own daily life, working away on the next book, and all the horrors of the news headlines. So again, I feel this new kind of commitment and compulsion to kind of write fiction that is relevant to today. It doesn't always have to be explicitly about today, but you certainly can't ignore what's going on. And you set this in an Irish context, a place that gives care. And our institutions in Ireland, as I think people know in many parts of the world, have very complex and sometimes very brutal pasts. So where vulnerable people come to be cared for, they've often been very brutalized. Did some of that influence your setting of the novel in Ireland? Definitely, I suppose. I suppose I feel if you're being very critical of things, it's probably best to make them your things, you know. So when I was writing, say, The Wonder, about a little child who's not eating in the 1850s, I set that in Ireland so that my critique of Irish Catholicism could be very much, you know, done on home territory rather than my pointing fingers at some other cultural tradition. And the same with The Pull of the Stars. I suppose I show the hospital as really a very good institution, very life-saving. But of course, it was a different time, so they've got some practices which we would find bizarre. For instance, when a stillbirth happens, they're pretty much told, put that stillbirth in a little cardboard box, package it up for disposal, and don't talk to the mother about it, don't show her, don't discuss it. You know, we'd find that brutal. And so one of my technical problems with the book was not to have the readers judge my nurses and doctors and think that they're horrible or incompetent people. You know, they're working with the skill set they have. But another institution that I included in the book as background is that I wanted to show somebody managing to sort of give out of a life that had no privilege in it at all. So I decided to invent a volunteer who turns up and helps at the hospital, who would be from an impoverished Irish background and would have experience of Irish residential institutions that was no good at all. And I was fascinated by the idea that, despite all she's been through, and I drew very closely, by the way, on the Ryan report on Irish orphanages and residential institutions. So despite many horrors that she's been through and the fact that she's never had any status within Irish culture, this young woman still has a kind of natural generosity and energy and vitality. And one thing that struck me in the Ryan report was how many of the people giving evidence said that they were made to feel useless or worthless, and they were always told, you have to work hard to try and pay society back because you've contributed nothing. So I was fascinated by the idea that a volunteer might actually find, in grueling hospital conditions, she might still find it a thrilling few days in her life because she's feeling important for the first time. She's feeling needed. So I have a very mixed sense, I suppose, about Irish institutions.
So, Emma, a little like, I was thinking, just like your volunteer in the Pull of the Stars, when COVID-19 began to impact in this part of the world, there was lots of drama and lots of predictions that we would turn into the very worst versions of ourselves, that kind of dystopian view of the world and humanity. And certainly here, talking about volunteers, I mean, people did people did extraordinary things for other people, and we didn't murder and rape each other, but people volunteered and they made bread. And they listened to the birds.
Well, for instance, the toilet paper hoarding, right? At first there were reports that toilet paper was running out. And so we all had an image of, certain, selfish people buying hundreds of rolls. Yeah. But it turned out it was just everyone buying a couple of extra rolls. Yeah. There was no dreadful behaviour with the toilet paper hoarding. So yes, I quite agree with you, Paul. In fact, I remember I read an article in which somebody asked an epidemiologist how they thought pandemic fiction tends to get it wrong. And he said, pandemic fiction tends to show the social order breaking down overnight, instant savagery. And in fact, people tend to behave extremely well and develop new forms of mutual care. So we've certainly been seeing that. There's a huge goodwill. I mean, here when I go out for walks, I'm skirting 6 feet around everyone and everybody's nodding and smiling, and there's been so much practical help of the more vulnerable. I wanted to show a novel in which the flu may be a total horror and the war's going on, but there's also a huge amount of sort of selfless service.
And confinement, so the confinement that you write about in The Pull of the Stars, the confinement that you write about in Room, of course. You've written and you've researched a lot about confinement and solitude. I'm wondering a little bit about how did it impact on your life and your family's life over the last few months? I've heard writers and artists say, well, actually, it didn't really impact on me because my life was pretty solitary. But any surprises? How did lockdown treat you all?
I've been having a very good lockdown. I felt very lucky, but it certainly made me oddly aware that my usual life is too busy. I mean, I'm a very extroverted writer, so I'm writing alone much of the day, but then I love to do things in the evening to see friends and so on. And I have missed all that, and I've definitely missed things like theatre and live music. But on the other hand, there has been an odd relaxation to it. And I realise I probably was burning the candle at two ends too much. So, it's not that it's going to transform my life, but I certainly have appreciated very much the kind of more relaxed pleasures of, say, for instance, this summer we bought a big inflated paddling pool for the hot Ontario summer. So, sitting around in the pool, squirting our kids with water pistols. Yeah. There's a lot to be said for it. Yeah. Low-key pleasures.
You said elsewhere that that Room was a meditation on safety versus freedom. And I think a lot of us have been kind of somewhere in the middle of safety and freedom, and some of that kind of the reflection, the kind of existential kind of questions, or the value questions that I think, I don't know if that's been true for you.
We've all been having these questions, and every household in every nation, they're sitting around saying, okay, hang on, is it worth taking this risk to get a haircut, or is it worth risking that I'll do harm to a neighbour by going to talk to her? I remember we wanted to drop off some chocolates at a neighbour's on Mother's Day, and so I swabbed the box with a Lysol wipe, and then I thought she won't know I have, so then I attached a post-it saying, I have Lysoled this box. So I was trying to do her some good and not do her harm. Yes, and then we're having discussions like, okay, at the moment I'm feeling like our kids have to go back to school, even if it's a risk, because I would feel terrible about keeping them out of school for longer.
Yeah.
So there are all these different ways of doing harm and benefit. And I find parenthood in particular really, that's why I wrote Room, because parenthood had really focused my mind on this question of, safety versus freedom. And you have to literally keep the baby from falling off the sofa and yet give the baby lots of stimulus.
Yeah.
I think parenthood has been a real gift to me as a writer, because it's really sharpened my focus on those sort of existential and ethical questions. And in a way which is never fixed. There's no final solution, because parenthood is renegotiated every single day. They're a day older and you're a day tireder. Even during lockdown, I've become a more relaxed mother, because I felt I don't want to be squabbling with them about so many things when so many things are forbidden already. So if I can say yes during this lockdown, I do, because the pandemic is saying no to them in so many ways.
You've described parenting as probably one of the most important human stories to be told, or that we tell. You do that. You talk about parenting in a way that strikes me as very unsentimental, and really, really good on the grey bits. It's all grey. But you really, I think you've really given voice to that, to the kind of in-between land, the paradox, the ambiguity of parenting, of relationships.
In a way, I think the reason parenting has been such a stimulating subject for me is that I couldn't always assume that I would get to be a parent. Coming out in Ireland, I felt like I was stepping onto the no children route. That's certainly how it seemed in the 80s. And I felt that was worth it to me to say, yes, I'm gay, this is my life, even if it means no kids. So then when, after a few years, I began thinking it might be possible to have children, and Chris and I ended up having 2 of them, it was very much chosen. And also, when there are 2 parents of the same gender, you do a lot of kind of thinking about your roles. None of it is just a sort of natural, oh, of course she will breastfeed and he will cut the grass. You have to think about all of it. So I think perhaps coming to parenting with a queer perspective allowed me to just see it a little bit fresh, and realize, it's not that everybody has to parent. It's one very particular way to spend your time, but it's a hugely rich and interesting way. Here's an example. Our kids call us by our first names, and some people are shocked by this. They think it's disrespectful. But the mammy daddy thing, which I grew up with, we couldn't use those words, so we had to pick other words, and it ended up being our names, Emma and Chris, that the kids use mostly. But that's the kind of thing that you just look at slightly afresh, because you had to think about parenting before doing it.
And I've heard you say, Emma, that it's probably been a different experience doing that in Canada, where the law has been on your side.
It has, but I don't like to generalise about Canada versus Ireland, because Ireland has changed so much. There may be ways in which Ireland has jumped ahead of Canada. So I wouldn't want to be comparing, Ireland circa 1990 with Canada now. Yeah. But let's just say that many of the laws did change earlier in Canada. So by the time we were having kids in 2003, we were already able to get, Finn's birth cert modified, so we were both his legal parents. So we have always felt, as it were, safe, getting back to safety versus freedom. We've always felt protected as a family by Canadian law. Yeah. And that certainly made a difference. Because then you just have the ordinary existential terrors of parenting. You don't have other ones like, will the government take my babies away?
Yeah. And the safety versus freedom, to go back to Room and to go back to Jack, and that granting of his freedom, of his escape, of allowing him escape, if you like, of letting him go, letting go of what we love. I mean, I guess as a parent, that's what you do or have to do, is it?
Yeah, I think Room worked and touched so many readers just because it's an intensified version of what every parent and every child does. You know, they're always going to grow up and leave you. Just in the case of Room, there's a moment where she has to let it happen all in one go. It's terrifying, but it is what every parent does when they wave their child off to school or see their child making choices that the parent wouldn't have approved of. Yeah, I mean, our son is learning to drive at the moment. I'm terrified every time he goes out there, but there's no way I'm going to stop him.
Yeah. You're also really interested, and I think I can say this as a psychologist. It strikes me that you're really interested in resilience, in what kind of keeps people afloat, what makes for human happiness. And as a psychologist, I can say, Emma, we do a really bad job in focusing on deficits, on what's broken, on what's not working properly. And I've certainly appreciated from your work the lens that kind of shifts and says, well, what actually are the ingredients of a happy life, of a meaningful life? Is that something? Is that real? Is that can you say something about that?
Yes, I would say there are two reasons for that. I'm very cheerful myself, so I wouldn't be likely to write stories that are entirely grim. They're often very grim in their setup, very morbid, very macabre, but they tend to lead towards the light in some way. But it's also a literary reason. Your reader has to have some reason to read your book. So there's kind of a bargain there. And I don't mean that I owe them sweetness and apple pie. Sometimes there will be tragic endings, but there still has to be a feeling that the story is meaningful, that it's not just a random, mess and chaos of a short and brutish existence. So I'm very careful when I tell dark stories to give the reader enough uplift or to give them, moments of escape. For instance, in The Pull of the Stars, you're jammed into that tiny little ward for 3 days. And so I put in one scene where they go up on the roof of the hospital and they have a little picnic up there and eat an orange, because we all, as readers, need some respite. So yeah, I'm very interested in those aspects. But sadly, it's very hard to make a good story out of plain ordinary happiness. My own life, for instance, really doesn't provide me with much in the way of narrative. Moves to Canada, is extremely happy for the next quarter of a century.
Well,
has two lovely kids.
Because you're
stay there.
I mean, your early life. So. You spent the first 20 years of your life in Dublin.
8 years in England doing a PhD.
8 years and 20-something in Canada.
Yeah. And I'm very lucky I've emigrated twice. Emigration is a wonderful experience for a writer. It's a slight defamiliarization device. It makes you look at your own culture outside. You're going, other people don't necessarily like Tayto crisps. We don't all taste the same way. You look at the new culture very much as an outsider as well. And it gives you that little arm's length perspective that I think is crucial to write.
And I mean, you were one of 8 children. You were the youngest of 8 children.
Yes, the favoured, spoiled one of 8. Yes.
Your parents were academics, and actually, I'm sitting in Newman House on St. Stephen's Green, and I think I understand that your family had a little interlude when they lived here. Did you live here?
That's right. Sometime in the 60s, before I was born, I think the first 6 of the kids and parents stayed in a flat upstairs from you for a couple of months.
Wow.
Yeah, because my father, Dennis Donaghue, at the time was UCD professor. Can't remember his job title. In the English department he was. And we were sort of lent a bit of Newman House to live in. So I always I used to look up at the building whenever I'd pass Stephen's Green. I'd look up and kind of go, we lived there.
Wow,
what fun. And I'm very fond of UCD in all sorts of ways. I really grew up on the Belfield campus. We lived right beside it. In the 70s, and I would go through that hole in the fence and explore those woods and write Wordsworthian poetry, all inspired by the trees of UCD. It's my home place in so many ways.
You described yourself as growing up. You were a straight A student, but you weren't straight. And at about 14, I think you realised that you were gay, that you were lesbian. And I mean, that was in Ireland in 1980s Ireland.
Sort of been, 80, 83, 84, not an ideal setting for it to happen.
Wow.
But, to a writer, it was a gift, because you need something to sort of shake you out of that feeling of, I'm normal, everything's normal, everybody's normal. You need to be jolted. So I think it's very good to come across one way in which you are the other, you are the abject, you are the despised, you are the bogeyman, because then it gives you an intense kind of sympathy with everyone else who's treated like dirt in one way or another by their culture. So I think it was, I think realizing I was gay and then parenthood have been the two great formative experiences for me that are behind all my books.
And realizing that you were gay in a culture, in a 1980s Catholic culture, where you felt like you were marginalized, you were outcast, you were very othered. Was it that you kind of wrote against? Because I guess that you are, from your reading, that actually your family life, unlike a lot of Irish writers, was quite happy. There wasn't a lot of trauma.
It was very happy and nurturing and literary, but I have to say, realizing that I was falling for a girl, it did sort of provoke me into writing, because I suddenly had a secret. I was, it's not so much that I actually was cast out, it's more I felt if anybody knew I would be cast out. So it's very paradoxical to feel you're this high status, straight A, running the debating society, doing plays with schools, and all this is fine as long as nobody knows your dreadful, filthy secret. So that was an odd experience, yes. I remember, say, when the first Channel 4 broadcasts were happening in Ireland, and there was a program in which young lesbians spoke direct to camera, and I remember watching this surreptitiously while my parents were out, thinking, oh my God, there are others out there.
There were others out there.
It feel as if they were outside of Ireland.
Yeah.
So you can imagine with what excitement I've seen the changes in Ireland in recent years. And when the marriage referendum went through, for instance, I was so moved.
You know that piece, Emma, and I don't know who says it, but to understand a human being, we need to know what was going on in the world when they were teenagers. So there isn't much between you and I, but growing up in Ireland as a teenager, there were two things that I remember vividly. They were the AIDS epidemic, the horror and the fear and the propaganda that was everywhere. And, Emma, we were growing up in a country where homosexuality was criminalised. We decriminalised in 1993. You were 20 something. So criminalised and an epidemic.
I wonder, I think gay men probably felt that more, whereas as a lesbian, of course, I was very aware of those two things, but it was mostly just the absolute silence, just the invisibility of Irish lesbians that I felt more. But I was very aware, sort of through gay male friends, of the sort of, the bigger shadows. And I remember going on the Pride March in '93 to celebrate decriminalisation, and just thinking, this is extraordinary. They've actually, changed a law that has an immediate effect on our lives, and we changed it. That's probably the best sort of political demo or celebration I've ever been on, was that one.
Really? Yeah.
Go all at once from criminalisation to anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And say a little bit more about the silence. The things that weren't talked about, your identity. Say a little bit more about that.
I remember, for instance, in our secondary school, we talked about everything. We had debates even about issues that were quite taboo, like abortion, but they were taboo, but they were morally taboo, but they could be discussed loud and clear. But they just didn't mention homosexuality at all. I think one Irish teacher in our sixth year wanted to suggest this might possibly be a way of interpreting a short story, but he couldn't say it out loud, and we all got confused, and then he was like, never mind. So it was just the unspeakable. And it was one of those things you knew was evil, but you had never been explicitly told. It's amazing how society can clearly communicate things without saying them out loud.
Oh, isn't it? Yeah.
And I remember the first few lesbian books I came across in books upstairs in Dublin, just, buying them immediately, but surreptitiously, feeling like, oh, will they judge me as they ring through my money?
Yeah.
So that desperate sense of need, I look back and it feels like an absolutely transformed world that I live in.
And Emma, was it different at home? I mean, was conversation different at home? Was there a different kind of silence at home?
It was very good, but again, the gay thing just didn't come up, and I had a lot to lose in that I was this approved of young woman. I wasn't a rebel. I was seen as very good. I was not, wasting any time with boyfriends or getting into any trouble with boyfriends or anything. So to feel that really I was this person that they would despise if only they knew. And that's why of my many lovely memories of my mother who died a couple of years ago, one of my very favorite memories is when I finally, at the age of 21, when I'd moved to England, so I was safely away from home. So on a Christmas visit home, I decided I was going to come out to her, and I was so scared of it, I had to delay my flight by a week to give me more time. And then I finally did it, sitting in the car, parked, staring at the garage. I finally told her, and she told me she had guessed when I was 16 and that I was still her little baby. I'm so moved by that, Paul. To feel that, to be all those years of your teens afraid that people are going to hate you, and then have your mother look at you with such love,
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Wow. I don't know about you, Emma, but I think that legacy of those years lived in fear, a fear that actually people might hate us. It's very formative, isn't it? It transforms how we are in the world in many ways. So not to suggest that it's a wonderful thing, but I've seen incredible things come from that pain and that isolation, and awful things too.
Maybe it makes us choosy about who we fill our lives with, because we don't ever want to feel like that again. So we seek out the ones who we know from the start are going to treasure us. One way it would take you. Or certainly, as a parent, I feel I never want my kids to be in any doubt about whether I would, be angry with them or punish them.
I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself here, but it feels like I'd like to ask you about this now. I think sometimes in your work, I've kind of seen it as a little bit of a Trojan horse, that you write in a way that invites people into different worlds that they mightn't necessarily find themselves in. You write in a way that, if I can say it very bluntly, I think nurtures a kindness, nurtures a kindness.
That's very nicely put, Paul. I'm certainly aware that I use certain things like, say, humor as a kind of a lubricant to bring in subjects that might make the reader tense otherwise. I've written a couple of books for children about a big family where a gay couple and a lesbian couple have lots of kids together. And I'm really aware that I bring in all sorts of touchy and tense issues, but the humor lets it all slide down. And with some of my other novels, I delay information. Yeah, like in several of my novels, for instance, by the end of the novel, there's a same-sex love story, but that's not what I lead with on page one. So I suppose I am aware of getting to kind of lead or lure the reader sometimes into a story that they didn't know they were going to care about.
You've said on more than one occasion, and it's something that's really stayed with me. You've said that fiction is a technology to create empathy, or to nurture empathy. Tell me more about that. I was intrigued by that.
I don't even just mean its effects on the readers, I'm aware as a writer that if I make a commitment to telling a story from the point of view of character A, I'm going to see it from their point of view, even if they're the baddie, for instance. The process of sentence by sentence saying what's going through the mind of character A, you're with them. So it's very powerful, even in its effects on me. And similarly, the reader is sucked into the mind of that person and will see things as they do. So, for instance, I once wrote a short story about rape as a war crime in the American War of Independence. There was an awful episode where the British troops, who were actually German mercenaries, they were stationed in New Jersey, and they raped the local girls en masse. So I wrote a short story, but from the point of view of a sort of, I think, 15-year-old, child soldier who'd been kind of, indentured into this, never chose to be a soldier, and ends up, committing rape along with his peers. And it's very dangerous to write a story that's sympathetic to the rapist. But in this case, I was really interested in weighing the kind of different traumas of being this child soldier finds himself in this appalling situation, and his victims. So I didn't want to do the obvious thing and just write a story about his victim, saying, oh, look, he's bad, he's the evil soldier, she's the victim. I wanted to do something more subtle. But I was aware that if I got it wrong, it would seem to be a story absolutely sympathizing with rapist soldiers. So that's, I suppose, what I mean about it being quite a dangerous technology of empathy, in that its effects are so powerful. And, reading novels changes people's opinion at a deep down level that no amount of rational argument will do.
Yeah, no amount of lecturing, no amount of wonderfully crafted opinion pieces. Fiction has a way in, I think, to the human heart and soul that kind of bypasses our defense systems in some ways. I think. Do you? Yeah. I
do. I mean, the parallel that's coming to my mind is, all these cell phone videos of that are being passed around by the Black Lives Matter movement. They're literally letting the rest of us see what it is like to have a policeman walk up to you threateningly, demand things, hector you, accuse you of holding a weapon when you're just holding, say, a rubbish picking up clamp. It literally puts you on the body of the person of color who is being harassed by police. And that one I think has changed minds in a way that no medium less visceral would have done. I think you needed to literally see what it's like to have the brutal police officer walk towards you.
Yeah. You said earlier on, Emma, about how, the dramatic changes that have social changes that have taken place in Ireland over the last 30 years. An Ireland that in some ways is unrecognisable. And I was thinking about that this morning, and thinking about how those changes came about, or they were hard won, on the back of people's personal stories. So people told stories about being gay, being lesbian, being transgendered, about having abortions. People told stories about being divorced in relationships that were abusive. People, very brave people told very delicate stories that really changed hearts and mind and brought about, I believe, the change that you're seeing now.
You're right, and I think that's particularly true for Ireland. I think in other countries you see often a much more explicit kind of civil rights campaigning, and in Ireland, maybe because it's such a small country, what I think of as having really changed people is people ringing up the radio and telling their story, or going on the Late Late. Just that willingness to expose yourself and to show that you are a human being, I think, has been transformative in Ireland. And often I think it means people then end up with a sort of more empathetic understanding, rather than just saying, yeah, okay, fine, we have to extend those civil rights. Yeah. If you've literally seen and talked to, for instance, the whole generation of people I'm seeing on social media now who are like, yeah, I'm Irish, and yeah, I'm Nigerian as well, or, mine isn't the face that you think of as Irish, but this is what Irish looks like now.
Yeah.
I think they humanize it, so it's not an abstract concept, multicultural Ireland, but they're making it real vivid, they're putting a face to it.
Yeah, a very powerful face that really, as I say, I think it kind of it can bypass a lot of our defences, and is as we say is more powerful than many other ways of doing that. One of the maybe just to go back ever so slightly in the wonderful story about the fasting girls, the wonder. So these girls across different parts of the world historically who were fasting and subject to a form of Catholicism that really was disembodied, that was kind of dismembered, that saw the body as something that was going to be your ruin. And that idea of women, the good woman doesn't have an appetite.
Yeah, it's funny if they're doing this, self-starvation in the year 1700, they're not specifically talking about looking skinny and glamorous, right? But they are talking about being pure, not needing food, being above the body. So this kind of ascetic idea of the good woman is weirdly transhistorical and transcultural. Just after I'd published The Wonder, which was very much focused on, the Catholic storyline of a fasting girl, there was a girl in India who died after a fast of several weeks, and she was of the Jain religion. So it's not just Catholicism, but as I was saying before, if you're going to be highly critical, you should probably stick to your own tradition. And I was really interested in all Catholicism had to offer, frankly, that I try and show it as this very uplifting religion for the poor, that they got to say, we are just as important as the kings and queens. The most humble little peasant girl can be a saint. So I'm trying to show that it offered huge amount of support and uplift and solidarity to the poor, but perhaps some of its costs were that it asked them to be pure and self-denying, and it asked those who'd already lost so much to give up more, and contribute more to the building of a church, and to be more obedient. So yes, I wanted to sort of explore the extremes of that by looking at a little girl who decides that God doesn't want her to eat.
Yeah, Emma, it's a form of Catholicism and in other organised religions, and without being too dramatic about it, did you get some of that? Did some of that kind of thinking impact on you as a Catholic Irish woman?
Not really. I mean, I remember moments of, say, every Lent we'd give up sweets, and there was this odd code that if somebody offered you a sweet or a piece of chocolate during Lent, you could take it home and tuck it behind your holy pictures and save it for Easter. So I'd have this grotty little collection of individual sticks of barley sugar and squares of Cadbury's behind my picture of St. Teresa. And of course, I'd obsess over it. Every night I'd check out my stash and look forward to Easter. So I don't think it did the intended thing, which was to keep my mind off sweets. But let's just say there were kind of cultural fossils. I would say I was not in the 70s raised on a kind of a hardcore old school Catholicism at all. There was an awful lot of post-Vatican II, mildness and talking about togetherness and love and so on. So no, the Catholicism I was critiquing in The Wonder is an older Catholicism, but it's the roots of our culture.
Sure.
And even the Irish habit of when you're first offered something, you say no, the kind of, I know, thanks. You have to be pressed to have the cup of tea and the scone. So it's interesting that there are these little lingering echoes of that self-denying attitude.
All of those influential, those pieces that influence, that shape and form us, and of course, as you say, in various parts of the world. I don't think that we can have this conversation without talking about George Floyd, without talking about Black Lives Matter, without talking about our own versions of that. In Ireland, with a direct provision system that's been in place for far too long, in Canada for First Nations people. I'm curious because for you as a historical fiction writer, in part, and where are you on the statues, on the removing of statues of Confederate people, on colonizers? What are your thoughts? What do we do about that?
I have to say, when I saw that statue of the slave trader in Bristol toppled into the water, I found that a glorious moment. Of course, I'm not suggesting some kind of wholesale removal of all statues of everyone who wasn't woke, but I don't think anybody is suggesting that. But I certainly don't feel that it's an anti-history impulse, because, history is made of these moments as well as being made of statues. So for me, it depends on the statue. We were discussing recently, us and our kids, there's a street in town named for somebody who held slave plantations, and they were discussing, should that street name be changed? And we were talking about how it'll cost a lot of money to change it, and maybe use that money for something a bit more concrete. So I noticed a lot of people of color on social media have been saying, okay, could you white people stop obsessing over the surfaces and actually focus on substantial stuff to do with funding of schools and equal access to healthcare and so on. So let's not get too caught up in the symbolic battles. But of course, they can matter too. So yeah, I don't mind if a few statues come down.
And you've been drawn in your work to some of those difficult historical issues, points, those sources that you've been drawn to, that in some ways I think kind of get at the best of humanity and at the worst of humanity. Can you say something about that, or is that the case?
I think a key moment for me was my first two novels were, lesbian-themed novels set in Dublin, and then I did a book of fairy tales. But then my first historical novel, I was writing about a servant girl who commits a murder, but I ended up inventing a character of a slave in that book, because I was appalled to realize that in 18th century Britain there were slaves. We always sort of blame the Americans for that. So that's the first time I started being sort of explicitly revisionist and trying to write things into the record of the past which have been left out. And so I would say that my interest in sort of women's history and queer lives has naturally led me to writing a lot about slavery and the history of Black lives as well. Because as soon as, like that moment I was talking about when you're 14 and you realize that you are the other in some way, that should open your mind to all the ways that people are treated as the other. It should give you a huge and committed interest in the lives of others. Now, of course, you have to be aware that you're not always the best person to tell the story. There's been a lot of rethinking of writers taking on subject matter that doesn't belong to their ancestors, and to what extent you're allowed to do that, and how much does it matter how you do it. So this is not an easy question, but I would say my writing ever since about my third book has kind of reached out its hands to histories other than my own, because there are such natural echoes and connections there.
I mean, you started to write. I think you said you started to write when you were 8. You wrote a poem, and your first love was poetry. You've been writing since. You've had you're 50 now. And you've had the same agent for more than 25 years, which I think is incredible. It's
great. It's like she's a mother figure, You bring her everything, your books which are not going to ever get written, maybe, your bad ideas, your books which will be a very obscure scholarly interest, and then your bestsellers, and she sort of welcomes them all. So I found it a very nurturing relationship.
And has the reason that you write, has the reason changed over the sweep of your writing life?
No, I fundamentally enjoy it. I get a thrill out of making stuff up, and I mean, I like some parts of it more than others. The beginning is very much like falling in love, so I'm often being wooed away by new ideas. Sometimes it's more of a slog to follow through on the older ideas, but no, I fundamentally find it the most enjoyable way I could spend my days. So even if I might sometimes have additional motives, like, you know, I wish to change the world or something, that's not the primary motive.
Right.
And there are more direct ways of changing the world. So no, if you choose to do it through fiction, it's probably because you just fundamentally love this particular form of magic trick.
I think, Emma, I speak for quite a few people when I say this. I'm very conscious of my colleagues in UCD in equality, diversity, and inclusion, and so many other people. But you're writing, you write in the outliers. It's almost as though you kind of put your arms around the waifs and the strays and the abnormals. You're speaking I think you're speaking some of that unspoken, that silence maybe that you experienced as a teenager, and that really is a very precious gift.
Thank you so much.
You
know, if I do, it's partly because their stories are more interesting. You know, and you could say I'm unscrupulously looking for the best stories wherever I'll find them. And in the stories that our society has left out, there will be more surprise. There will be more that's unpredictable. So I'm always following my pleasure. I'm never putting someone into a book out of feeling of like duty. Must be good to them by including them. No, it's much more like, wow, that's a story I've never heard before.
Emma, it's been a real pleasure. From the team here in Mali, from the team in UCD, in Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, just a heartfelt thanks. You're our first guest on this project, past, present and Pride project, and it couldn't have been better. So a deep, deep heartfelt thanks and appreciation.
Same to you. Thank you, all of you, for making this happen.
Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. For me, literature, for me, writers, for me, the arts, in some ways, capture what's often missed in conversation, what's often missed historically when it comes to the lives of people, who, for various reasons in this country and beyond, don't experience an equal world, a world that is accommodating, is embracing of diversity, and certainly a world that isn't inclusive. So I feel the arts and literature play a very, very central and important role in advocating for a more equal, a more just, a more diverse and inclusive society.
You've been listening to a podcast from RadioMoLI, which broadcasts from MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. If you've enjoyed this programme, do consider becoming a MoLI member or giving membership to a friend. It's the best way to support the museum and its programming. Visit moli.ie/membership to find out more. Thank you for listening.